I'd like to welcome everyone to our fourth webinar in the Reimagining the Creative Arts Curriculum and the Canon series. This webinar series is presented with support from the National Forum for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education and NUI Galway. So we're delighted today to welcome many excellent speakers who are going to be contributing to a discussion on editing early modern texts in the classroom. So also, just before beginning, I want to make just a couple of short introductory remarks to help contextualize today's webinar. So as part of the broader Curriculum in the Canon project that's currently underway here at NUI Galway, my colleague, Dr. Justin Tonra, and I are currently in the process of designing a new interdisciplinary postgraduate module. And our vision for this is to capitalize on existing research strengths that we have here at NUI Galway in early modern drama, but also in textual studies and digital humanities by launching an interdisciplinary module in which we'll have postgraduate students working collaboratively to produce a new openly accessible digital edition of a currently understudied early modern play. And so as my colleague Justin and I were thinking about the shape that our own module might take, we started scouring the internet to try to see if we could find other examples of projects that sort of shared interests with this one, or initiatives where there were students in other universities who were doing similar sorts of innovative work with early modern texts, especially, but not exclusively, actually, editorial work. So we found that programs from major international conferences in early modern studies, particularly the Renaissance Society of America and the Shakespeare Association of America, were a really valuable source for kind of actually locating other people who seemed to be working on and who are now actually publicly presenting on projects that share kind of a similar concern with our own. And in fact, we discovered that there were a couple of panels that were initially meant to run in the canceled Renaissance Society of America conference back last year in the spring of 2020 that spoke very directly to some of the concerns of our current project. So we're very lucky to actually have been able to invite many of those same speakers who didn't actually speak last spring at the canceled Renaissance Society of America. We're very lucky to actually have been able to invite a number of them here to talk about their projects with us today. And in some ways, that's really kind of the genesis of this panel. So I'm going to hand things over to my colleague Justin Tonra now, who will do the introductions for our presenters today.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Justin Tonra and I'm a lecturer in English at NUI Galway. My background is in digital humanities and literature of the Romantic period. I'm not an early modernist, so I'm an interloper today in that regard. But I have worked in digital scholarly editing on editions such as Thomas Moore's The Gypsy Prince, which is published at the Romantic Circles website, and on Ossian Online, which is an edition of James Macpherson's sequence of Ossianic poems from the 18th century. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd just like to extend my thanks to a couple of people. To Patrick Lonergan, who took the lead on the grant application, which has funded the whole Curriculum and Canon initiative. I also want to thank Ciara Murphy, who's been working very hard to put together this series of webinars, among other tasks. Emer McHugh has worked on some research towards Lindsay and my module that we're working on, so I'm grateful to her for that. And also to Sarah Hoover, who is the tech manager for this webinar today. So our first speaker today, unfortunately, can't be with us in person, but he has sent a recording of his presentation, and that is Joshua Eckhardt. Joshua is a professor of English at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he is the author of Manuscript Verse Collectors and the Politics of Anti-Courtly Love Poetry from 2009. And he's the co-editor with Daniel Starza Smith of Manuscript Miscellanies in Early Modern England. He's also the founding co-editor of British Virginia, a series of documentary editions related to the colony. And Sarah is going to show his video right now.
Hello, I'm Joshua Eckhardt. I'm a professor of English at Virginia Commonwealth University. Thank you very much for including me today. I'm sorry that I can't present this live. I'm teaching at this time. I want to tell you about a project, a course that I taught in 2018 called Documentary and Critical Editing. It's a pretty experimental course for me, at least. And I want to tell you about it because the students in this class ended up improving the text of a canonical English Renaissance poem. A rare feat, certainly the only time I've ever been involved in such a thing. Now, that's not all they did. Let me first tell you about two documentary editing projects that they did. They worked on a single witness edition, a digital edition of Aphra Behn's play, The Widow Ranter. I walked in on the first day of class with my own fabrications of unfolded sheets of that edition, and the students started by folding them, figuring out how to stab and stitch them. And we used that as the first textbook of the course. But they spent a lot of their time each laying out one page of the edition, layering the transcript under the images to make the PDF that we publish through British Virginia, to make the text in the images searchable. Then we went on to another documentary editing project. The students in the course joined students who over 3 different semesters triple transcribed an entire book of poems, over 300 pages, over 500 poems. The effort was led by VCU's student organization for paleography called the Superscripts. Here they are at the Transcribathon they hosted to support the effort. And there's Heather Wolf joining us via Zoom to show us the document that the students are all transcribing. When they were done, the students traveled to Folger Shakespeare Library. The Superscripts did, only some of whom are in the course I'm telling you about. And they got to see in person the manuscript that they had gotten to know so well by transcribing it. Back in the editing course, we used the manuscript that we were transcribing to shift from single witness documentary editing to multiple witness critical editing. We looked at how critical editors had recorded, if at all, the presence of canonical poems by Shakespeare, in the case of this sonnet, or Donne, in the case of this lyric, in critical editions. But we spent a lot of time on this poem beneath the red box, Love's Diet. We basically tried to edit this poem according to the standards of the Variorum edition of the poetry of John Donne before the Variorum editors got to it. In this poem, Donne's speaker says that his love has grown so great that it's basically gotten fat and he needs to put it on a diet. To what a cumbersome unwieldiness and burthenous corpulence my love hath grown, but that I did to make it less and keep it in proportion, give it a diet, make it feed upon that which love worst endures, discretion. By the end of the poem, the diet seems to have worked. Thus I reclaim this buzzard love to fly at what and when and how and where I choose. Now, negligent of other sport, I lie. And now, as other falconers use, I spring a mistress, write, swear, sigh, and weep, and the game lost or killed, go talk and sleep. Talk or sleep, excuse me. Right, he's turned into an unfeeling lover who doesn't necessarily care whether he's lost the game or killed the game. He can be a player without being too emotionally involved. I think you'll agree that this word is endures, that it's got a little R with a foot there. That's many texts of the poem read endure in manuscript, and all but one text of the poem ever printed reads endures. But it's not true of all of them. Many manuscript texts read endues, same word, whether it begins with an E or an I, but without the letter R. I think if you count the minims there, you'll see that's a U and then an E and an S. This word kept coming up in otherwise very good texts of the poem. And I kept discounting it. And the students stopped me in one class and said, well, what does that word even mean? And I have to admit, I did not know that it had this second meaning related to digestion, particularly of a hawk into the stomach, to digest, to endue her gorge, her meat. And but by the time we got down to this reference in the OED, we started to get convinced. The OED cites a sermon by none other than John Donne using the word endue to mean precisely to digest their meat, such as they are able to digest and endue. Now, here's the one printed copy ever to read endues of Love's Diet. It's from the second printed edition. The first one reads endures. After this, the third edition reads endures. And it's true through all other editions. Even when modern critical editors claim that they're taking their text from a manuscript that actually reads endues, they amend it to endures, whether they do so silently or they record the emendation. We convinced ourselves that this poem should read endues and not endures, that the R was added by multiple scribes and compositors who didn't know the word endues any more than we knew it at the start of this class. We decided it made a lot more sense for a diet for the love to be put on a diet and allowed to eat only that which it can least well digest, particularly if that love is figured as a bird of prey or a falcon or a buzzard later in the poem. A bird-specific word for digestion in the first stanza of the poem means that that metaphor doesn't just come out of nowhere at the end. It's right there as a central conceit at the very beginning of the poem. We invited Gary Stringer, who was then the general editor of the Very Orm edition, to join us by Zoom. We made our case. We convinced him. He said that if he had been, that he thought that the Very Orm should see things our way. When the Very Orm editors finally did get to this poem, they got in touch. We showed them our work. They were very interested, and in the end, they sent to press an edition that acknowledges our class and saying that their entry, and especially its treatment of the endures variant, is indebted to our class. Now, that would be nice, even if they decided that actually we were wrong, but they didn't. They decided to go with a text that reads endues. They decided that it was much more likely that scribes added the R than that they took it away, and they chose a copy text. Well, the copy text I showed you, one of the ones that we were considering, one of the ones that made us look the word up. In general, I think this is just fantastic. This is way better than I ever expected, to take a poem that has been edited and printed and read. It's the first poem I ever memorized, and I knew that it said endures. But by going through the work of critical editing, that involved, by the way, by transcribing every manuscript of the poem, over 4 dozen of them, collating them, working through them, we found that there can still be stuff to learn. There can be mistakes that every editor's made that students can find. Now, I think I've answered a few of the questions I was given for this, but not all of them. Challenges, this class had a number of challenges, and a big part of them was that part of the challenge had to do with the fact that I wasn't coming in with a text that we were reading and a performance or a discussion that I was ready to give. It was more like going to work or having a group of detectives just trying to figure out a case. And that certainly had some frustrations and challenges for me. I don't know that I'll teach the class again. And if I did, I would do it differently. What one piece of advice would I offer somebody who's considering something like this? My one piece of advice would be ad fontes, to go to the sources as much as you can. That not everybody has rare books on their campus. I don't have rare books that I could teach for this course on my campus, but a lot of us have computers and cameras. I would just encourage people to work on original sources as best they could. I'm about out of time, so thank you very much for including me in this mediated way. I'm sorry that I can't join the conversation properly. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you to Joshua in absentia. And I agree that this is a fantastic example of the impact that this kind of teaching and learning can have on the authorized history of major writers' works. So what a great way to start this seminar. Our next speaker is Kristen Abbott-Bennett, who's an assistant professor of English at Framingham State University. She's the project founder and director of the Kit Marlowe project and is on the map of early modern London pedagogical team. Kristen serves on the editorial board of This Rough Magic, a peer-reviewed academic online journal dedicated to the teaching of medieval and Renaissance studies, and has served both as visiting faculty and on the advisory committee for the Folger Shakespeare Library's digital anthology of early modern English drama. Kristen has edited a collection of essays entitled Conversational Exchanges in Early Modern England, 1549 to 1640, in 2015, and has published several articles discussing medieval and early modern literature, as well as complementary digital pedagogies in venues including New Technologies in Medieval and Renaissance Studies, which is forthcoming, Renaissance and Reformation / Renaissance a Reform, and Marlowe Studies, an annual, and Upstart, a journal of Renaissance Studies. Okay, Kristen, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Justin and Lindsay so much for inviting me to talk about scholarly editing in the context of the work I do on the Kit Marlowe project. If you want to play along at home, the website is www.kitmarlowe.org, and you can actively search many of the tiles I'll be talking about today. So my focus today is to talk about the work I do with students to publish TEI encoded diplomatic editions of early modern works with the Kit Marlowe project. As most of you know, Christopher Marlowe was Shakespeare's arguably more interesting contemporary. His friends called him Kit, and so do we. To start, I'll offer a quick overview of the site and its rationale before I share activities and materials so you can try this at home. The Kit Marlowe project features a wealth of student-generated content, including a mini archive of Marlowe-related texts, a growing curated collection of Marlowe's online works and performances, a selection of Life and Times exhibits, games and quizzes, an encyclopedia, and contributor resources that include how-to videos designed to help students conduct primary and secondary source research. In addition to the student-generated resources, the site also features teaching materials, some of which I'll share with you today. Our growing mini archive brings Marlowe-related texts out from behind institutional paywalls to offer a better sense of the conversational exchanges that produce these works, as well as those they inspire. So far, we have published several diplomatic editions of texts that were unavailable elsewhere at the time of publication. We use single source, single witnesses from EBO to EBO, and these diplomatic editions strive to recreate the text as closely as possible, retaining most original letter forms and spellings. These TEI encoded editions are all published on Northeastern Digital Scholarship Group's Tapas platform, where one may not only read them, but download them and do with them basically whatever you like. Introducing students to editorial practices using primary texts, whether in physical archives or using digital surrogates, can help students actively transition from knowledge consumers to knowledge makers. Classroom editorial projects that incorporate research-based learning models, where the professor shifts, to quote Alison King's eponymous article, from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. Even when creating relatively lightweight diplomatic editions, students must make multiple decisions about expanding abbreviations, supplying signatures, identifying persons, places, foreign languages, and more. Students must conduct research to confirm hypotheses about individual words and proper names, and to annotate persons and places, much like Joshua Eckhardt was just discussing with that brilliant exploration of the word Hindu. So for example, encoding the personography requires students ascertain persons' alternate names, genders, birth and death dates, to write a synopsis of their person and provide a hyperlink to an open source resource that contains additional information. So in theory, these tasks are straightforward, but practice continually proves otherwise. Birth dates are frequently approximations and complicated by needing to determine which calendar year system was in use at a given time. And further, mythological figures, fluid embodiments, and shape-shifting challenged the TEI's early use of the sex, excuse me, tag binary that assigned 1 to males and 2 to females. Happily, they've recently updated this, the sex tag, and now offer binary and transsexual options. Although the TEI is extensible and we could get as creative as we like with our tagging practices, to do so would defeat the purpose. The primary reason for using TEI guidelines is to achieve consistency across encoded texts and interoperability across platforms. Our encoded texts are ultimately data sets, and our goal remains to make them useful to ourselves and others as such. There's consensus that designing pedagogy to foster reciprocal learning opportunities that resituate students as classroom experts, again, as knowledge makers rather than consumers, increases students' personal investments in their learning and results in the development of meta-literacies, immeasurable cognitive, behavioral, affective, and metacognitive learning outcomes. But how do we assess these outcomes? Using rubrics to assess task completion is helpful, but these may risk occluding students' affective and behavioral learning outcomes. To that end, I also ask students to write metacognitive reflections that consider how their engagement in slow reading as they work through the discrete tasks of scholarly editing, including document analysis, transcription, encoding, and annotation, has changed their approaches to reading and to research, and to consider what extra academic skills they've learned from collaborating with their peers. If you're curious, the Sites About section also features more excerpts from these reflections. In these, you can see on the top left, proud looks kind of small, but emerged over 40 times in this small subset of 25 reflections. It was pretty great. Disclaimer, tedious also emerged, but I'm happy to talk about that later. So our mini archive is indebted to Janelle Genstad and Martin Holmes, who have generously shared encoding schema, templates, and how-to guides developed for the map of early modern London and linked early modern drama online. You'll find our adaptations of selected materials in the teaching resources, editorial methods, and TEI exhibit that I'll walk you through now. So whether working with material or digital texts, document analysis offers students an entry point to descriptive bibliography. The current form that you can find here and download is designed to work with digital surrogates and offers tips for researching a document's metadata in library catalogs. I've kind of shifted the focus when I had to move out of material archives and work solely with digital archives. The how-to transcription assignment provides instructions for creating diplomatic transcriptions. This activity engages students in what I call slow reading practices, and it's also a great standalone exercise to use in class. The Teaching TEI page features how-to guides for encoding digital editions. It walks users through encoding div structures, formworks, and inline features, and it also discusses how to use CSS to encode layout and style. The TEI metadata and personography page provides downloadable instructions for the same. And I've also created a proofreading checklist designed to help students peer review one another's encoding projects. Finally, the EBO TCP assignment is an in-class assignment that does not require encoding skills or software. And these in-class encoding editorial assignments reap nearly the same benefits according to students as publicly publishing their works online. They achieve those learning outcomes of slowing down, thinking critically, and applying different kinds of behavioral skills that they learn from teamwork to extra academic pursuits. I'm thinking of a student who was recently talking about how this helped her edit the school newspaper. This iteration has benefited from replacing comment-driven annotations, which got really sloppy, with a much tidier color coding system that I borrowed from Claire Bourne's excellent Editing the Sea Voyage assignment that you'll hear about next. Classroom editorial projects offer an ideal opportunity to transform what David Wiley has called disposable assignments into renewable ones. The latter are defined by Open Educational Group as those that offer students opportunities to engage in meaningful work, add value to the world, and provide a foundation for future students to learn from and build upon. Renewable assignments are an alternative to traditional disposable assignments, which students throw away after they are graded, end quote. I like this definition because a key element is building a foundation other students can learn from and build upon. Everything we do at the Kit Marlowe Project embodies this principle. Publishing work in public-facing knowledge bases raises the stakes for any given project and increases students' investment in their work, but is not without its challenges. Rarely does a single semester offer all students enough time to create publication-ready work. At the Kit Marlowe Project, we solve this problem by force multiplying collaboration and extending research, revision, and proofreading activities over time across semesters, as well as groups of students and interns. Evelyn Tribble has discussed how teaching students book history can help them recognize the single book as a fiction, how copy-specific evidence attests to the social network in which the object has been embedded and circulated. Here, Tribble's talking about working with students in special collection archives. I love working with students in archives, but as we know now with COVID, that's not always possible. And I'm starting to think it's desirable, but not necessarily necessary for students to appreciate these social networks from which these early modern texts have emerged. Much as Latin tags redirect readers to external works in a larger conversational network of texts, by posing queries using the descriptive elements and attributes encoded in pointy brackets, readers can explore larger conceptual networks that can be difficult to apprehend through linear reading. Editing archival works and making them accessible extends early modern conversations into the digital world. When students engage in critical editorial work, they can recognize their places in an extended network of literary history. We were asked to close with a bit of advice for those undertaking editing projects, so here's mine. I was tempted to go with Pride Comes Before Fall because you really can't have that when working in digital humanities at all. But I've gone with It Takes a Village. Collaboration with colleagues and students is not only critical for creating successful student-generated editions, but also is one of the most rewarding aspects of these projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen. That was wonderful. I really love the idea of renewable assignments and seeing on the website how this material accumulates over different iterations of the course being taught. It's a really wonderful resource. So thank you. Our next speaker is Claire Bourne, who is Assistant Professor of English at the Pennsylvania State University, where her teaching and research focus on early modern drama, book history, textual editing, and theatre studies. Claire is the author of Typographies of Performance in Early Modern England, which was published last year. And she's published extensively on book design and the history of reading. She is the editor of Shakespeare Text, a collection forthcoming from Arden Bloomsbury this year, and of Henry VI Part 1 for the Arden Shakespeare 4th series. She's collaborating with Jason Scott Warren on a series of projects related to the Free Library of Philadelphia's copy of Shakespeare's First Folio, which was annotated by John Milton, and is general editor of the digital Beaumont and Fletcher 1647, an open access student generated edition of the copy of the Beaumont and Fletcher First Folio in the Eberly Family Special Collections Library at Penn State, a copy which has been marked up for early performance. Claire, over to you.
Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Lindsay and Justin for the invitation to present. And I just want to say how inspired I have been by the pedagogy work of so many of the people here. I learned a lot from Josh Eckhardt too, who's my former colleague at Virginia Commonwealth University. So this is wonderful. I'm going to share my screen here. So if Josh and Kristen were talking more about the results of the work that they've done in the classroom, my comments here are more aimed at assignment design. So I'm actually going to walk you through the editing assignment that I designed for an upper level English course, English 445 here at Penn State, which is the Shakespeare's Contemporaries course. So it's not an elective course. It is a course on the books that students can take for their pre-modern requirement. So with that in mind, I'll walk you through how I designed this assignment, which was a semester-long assignment, but where I also had to teach other things in the course. So the inspiration for this assignment came from the copy of Comedies and Tragedies written by Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher Gentleman, which is here in Penn State Special Collections. And it is a copy of this folio that's really quite interesting because it is 3 of the plays in the edition in the copy are marked up for very early performance. And past scholarship has called this kind of like has dated this as kind of the earliest printed play marked up for possibly professional performance. Jury's still out. We're doing some work on whether we want to support that claim or not, but these are the 3 plays that are marked up for performance. I did not choose to use one of these plays with my undergraduates. This was the first time I'd done such a big assignment around editing in the undergraduate classroom, and I wanted to keep it as streamlined and simple as possible. So what I did was I chose to edit The Sea Voyage with them, which was a play that I had just finished editing for Jeremy Lopez's just released Routledge Anthology of Early Modern Drama that came out last year. I wanted to work with a play that I was intimately familiar with as an editor so that I could help my students as they worked through this text. So the learning objectives for this course were several, and these are my learning objectives for the course, not the ones that are stated in our bulletin. I want my students to have a knowledge of historical, social, political, and theatrical contexts in which early modern plays were written. I want them to have a facility with reading pre-modern texts in modern editions. I want them to have the ability to read, observe, analyze, and synthesize literary texts in their own writing. I want them to have an appreciation for plays as a genre of imaginative writing, right? They're very familiar with the novel and with poetry, but plays, I want them to come out of the course with that. And an awareness, this is sort of my passion in teaching, an awareness of the material processes that led to the survival of the play texts over time. So that's a lot to cover in just one semester. And so I'm going to discuss how this assignment sort of factors into those learning objectives. So setting up the assignment, I've got a screenshot of part of my syllabus. This is the very beginning of the semester. So I was thinking about what do students need to know? What kind of context do they need to have in order to be able to edit? This is not the skills of editing, but what sort of knowledge that they have to have. They have to know how to read early modern plays. So I had them we read together The Spanish Tragedy and The Roaring Girl, which were 2 different genres. I wanted them to have a familiarity with genre. The Sea Voyage is a tragicomedy, so it's got elements of comedy and elements of tragedy in it. So I wanted them to understand kind of the range of genre. I wanted them to understand playhouse and performance practices. So as we read Spanish Tragedy and The Roaring Girl, we thought very closely about how there are cues and clues for action that are embedded in dialogue, how stage directions work, how editors supplement stage directions to help readers. So I really wanted my students to be in the position of the reader and what do they need from the text in order to understand what's going on. And then also reading early print, because I had them read The Sea Voyage, as I'll discuss in a second, from the first folio, right? I did not have them use my modern edition. I could have done that, but I had them read from the folio. So as we read Roaring Girl and Spanish Tragedy, we would read snippets of the early editions of those plays so that they understood. And I also assigned Eugene Giddens how to read a Shakespearean play text, which is a quite accessible how-to book for how to approach early print. I've had great success both at the undergraduate and graduate level using that book. So the assignment overview. Part 1, we read the play together and they had a chance to read the play individually. They chose a passage to edit. They prepared the text. They created commentary. They subjected their part of the, or offered, I should say, their part of the play up for peer review. And then they submitted their final edition with a reflection letter. So I'm going to walk you through each of these processes or each of these steps now. So we started by reading the play. I provided them with a PDF of the play from the Penn State Special Collections. And I added line numbers so that we could orient ourselves. So you'll see those in red here. We read the play together. And each day they had to produce an editorial post, which was really about 1 or 2 lines of text. I'll talk about that in a second. So we read through the play. 2 of the research assistants on our Bowman and Fletcher project, Taylor Hare, who I believe is in the audience today. Hi, Taylor. And David LeBlanc, who's the general editor for The Sea Voyage for our project, both guest lectured during this time. We then went to special collections to look at the object, and then students chose a passage. So I gave them some instructions for how to read the play as we were reading it together. Basically, like, make a good faith effort to understand what's going on, embrace the difficulty of reading in this early edition. It's not easy. Try your best to understand the dramatic situation. What have you learned from having read other plays? Apply that here and take notes. Right? Take notes on what you understand and what you don't understand. We would come together and talk about it in class, but they would also have to write these editorial posts, which was to choose a single word, a phrase, or a couple of lines, transcribe it, paraphrase it, and then a few sentences of analysis. These were really short posts that were designed to have students kind of home in on just one aspect of the text to unpack. So this is how to get them to familiarize them with this kind of close reading. So I'm always looking for backdoors into close reading. This was the first step for that, because they were going to have to do this with 100 lines of the play. So this was how they practiced. Then they chose about 100 lines to edit. So I broke the play down into 100-line chunks. And I actually had 2 students editing each set of 100 lines. They would edit separately, but they could consult each other if they wanted to. And we had some workshops in class where they did that. Then prepare the text. There are a few steps here. I had them transcribe. The first step was to transcribe their 100 lines. So I provided them with an example here, and they transcribed using the long S, basically transcribe exactly how you see it in the edition or the copy that you're using. So they transcribed. Then they paraphrase. So this is where I could make sure that they understood what was going on in their passage. And there were definitely some misfires here. And so I had to work closely with a number of students to make sure that they understood what the characters were saying, that they understood where the action was. And I had them try to keep track of words they found really difficult, phrases they were confused by, moments of implied action, because I said to them, this is going to come up when you gloss the text, when you annotate the text. So students were actually really good at keeping track of where they encountered difficulty as a reader so that they could then be a better editor for future readers. And then they would modernize the text. This was probably the trickiest part after they understood what was going on. And what they did was that they spelling, changes to spelling, they highlighted in red, and changes to punctuation, they highlighted in blue. And they did this so that David LeBlanc, our grad assistant general editor of this play, could then use this data for encoding the text. We are also using TEI, as Kristen explained. So I gave them some pointers, and I had a whole appendix on this assignment sheet that I'm happy to share with anybody about how to regularize formatting here. So it was just, this is kind of like a case of them following instructions, but then there were always these moments of modernizing, like, what is this word actually? Because this is when they had to start making decisions as an editor. Okay, so part 4, create commentary. So once they had a modernized text, they could then create the commentary that was going to help future students who use this modernized edition to understand the text. And so these are the tags that Kristen was referring to. I had them highlight references to places in dialogue, names in dialogue, props or stage directions embedded in dialogue. And then as a class, we came up with 2 categories that we wanted to track through the play. One was references to religion. So these were the students proposed and voted on these, references to religion and references to food and hunger. And this was great because it got us into an analytic mode, right? There's a lot in the Sea Voyage about actual food and ingestion, but then there's also a lot of figurative language about like eating words, for instance, or references to sex as a kind of consumption. So then we could talk about, well, should we highlight those under that category? So I found that pretty exciting. I thought those conversations were among the most exciting we had during the course of the semester. Students had to add at least 4 stage directions to their passage based on implied action or stage business in the dialogue. They then had to provide 15 glosses to words or phrases using the Oxford English Dictionary, and they had to format their notes as a professional editor would. And then they had to write 5 substantive annotations, and here's where the kind of research component of the assignment came in. So I worked closely with students on advising them on how to find information about certain aspects of the text that they wanted to explain more about. And this was also extremely exciting. I could not predict what they would be excited about annotating, and I couldn't predict what resources because I didn't know what direction they were going to go in. So this was a lot of effort on their part and a lot of effort on my part, but I think it worked out really well in the end. Finally, we had this peer review moment where students traded their passages, and the peer reviewer then had to provide a short summary of the passage, list words they needed glossing, right? So the editor might not have glossed words that actually needed glossing. Again, implied action that the editor overlooked that this reader kind of needed an explanation for, and writing 1 additional annotation for the passage, and then talking about strengths and weaknesses, or I framed this as areas for improvement. And these were really constructive reviews. I was really impressed with how my students approached this. It was here was the spirit of collaboration, that we're producing this edition that future students are going to use together. And then finally, and this is where I'll talk about the kind of advice I have for anyone working on a project like this. As Kristen mentioned, tedium comes up a lot in student feedback on an assignment like this. I mean, there's a lot of positivity around it too, but yeah, this is tedious work. It's highly detail-oriented work. And so I found it really important to have students step back and write a reflection on the work that they had done, so that they could see that it wasn't just about like fixing the text, that they really had learned a lot about how this text worked as a play, about their own practices as readers, about how they're going to approach modern editions in the future when they're in a different kind of class. So they had to reflect on how their passage was important to the play as a whole, because they've been so focused on this one passage. I wanted them to kind of zoom out. What should readers pay attention to in the passage as they read it? How did you address feedback from your peer reviewer? So they actually had to engage that process here, describe that process. They had to talk about what was rewarding and what was challenging about editing. So I'm definitely someone who embraces negative emotion in the classroom, and so to acknowledge challenge and to acknowledge failure is really important. And my students were really game for being substantive in the way they described what was really challenging without being complainers about it. And then what questions do you still have about the process of editing or about the play? And these were also really constructive. Students were left with these questions that were like big picture questions that I don't think they would have arrived at had they not done this detail oriented work, or if I had just taught them the play. All right, so these questions were really coming from the text up. So finally, the next step here is for their edition to be published through the Beaumont and Fletcher project. We're working on this phase 1 of the project. David LeBlanc, as I said, is the general editor of this play, and he's done an amazing job on converting what my students did in kind of like a non-digital space into a fully encoded text. That'll be open access and available hopefully very, very soon. If you're interested in following this project, we're at Beaumont Fletch on Twitter, and we'll be sharing news about our launch hopefully really soon. But I'm happy to talk about the Beaumont and Fletcher project. I'm happy to talk about the other challenges that I faced with this project, but hopefully it's illuminating to kind of see this step-by-step process. If I did this again, I would do it in a senior seminar or an elective class and not in a class like 444, which is supposed to give students maybe a broader overview of non-Shakespearean drama. So thanks so much. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Claire, for another wonderful presentation. I love how you are constantly thinking about, and indeed Kristen as well, about what the students are doing practically to edit these plays, how that reflects back on their broader encounter with literature, and how you're asking them to reflect on this constantly. I think that's a really, really valuable thing. And for every student who finds this kind of very precise editorial work tedious, I hope there is another student who finds like, this is it, this is what I want to do, this is something really, really wonderful, and this is the kind of precision and forensic reading that really suits me. And I speak as one of those students from long ago. Okay, our next speaker is Sarah Connell, who is the Assistant Director of the Women Writers Project and the new lab for texts, maps, and networks at Northeastern University. Her research focuses on text encoding and computational text analysis, medieval and early modern literature and historiography, and pedagogies of digital scholarship. Sarah's current projects include Making Room in History, a text encoding and analysis project on early modern narratives of national identity, Word Vectors for the Thoughtful Humanist, an NEH-funded seminar series on research and teaching with word embedding models, and Representing Racial Identity in Early Women's Writing, a project examining discourses around race in the Women Writers online collection. Sarah's recent and forthcoming publications include Writing, Reception, Intertextuality, Networking Women's Writing, co-authored with Julia Flanders for the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies, Performance and Pedagogy, the Global Shakespeare's online Merchant of Venice course in the Shakespeare and Digital Pedagogy collection, and Companions, Competitors, Contexts, Margaret Cavendish in Women Writers Online for the Cambridge Companion to Margaret Cavendish. Sarah, take it away.
All right, I will just share my screen. And there we go. So I want to start by thanking all of the organizers for pulling together this really exciting event, and also thanking my co-panelists and all of you for joining us here today. And I should also note that I will be presenting on some deeply collaborative work. So I want to extend my thanks to my colleagues at the Women Writers Project and to Professors Marina Leslie and Elizabeth Maddock-Dillon, who have been excellent partners in teaching the digital student edition projects that I will be discussing today. So I took the title of my presentation from Sarah Butler's 1716 Irish Tales, a historical novel set during the 11th century. In the preface to her novel, Butler describes the significant wealth of university scholarship in Ireland, citing 17th century historian Geoffrey Keating in her claim that there were once no fewer than 7,000 scholars at just one of the great universities that she lists. I chose this quotation partly because it seemed appropriate to begin with a celebration of Irish university scholarship during an event like this, but also because it provides a great example of some of the features that can be marked with text encoding. Today, I'll be discussing a text encoding class project that I teach in early literature classes at Northeastern University in Boston. In this project, students work in teams to create digital editions of archival documents using the text encoding initiative markup language. Before I dive into the project, it will be helpful to include just some quick background on text encoding. We use the text encoding initiative markup language to create digital models of humanities documents. The TEI is an international community standard used in a wide range of research projects, including the Women Writers Project where I work. The primary activity of encoding is naming and marking the boundaries of textual features. We use what are called elements to delineate the features that we're interested in. So for example, here we can see a place name element being used to encode the word Ireland. We also see a person name element being used to encode Keating's name. And we can see the names of the universities being marked out with a more general name element. So what we're doing is we're identifying and we're delimiting selected parts of this document. For example, saying this is the name of a place, and it starts here and it ends here. In addition to elements, we can also use what are called attributes to provide more information about our elements. This simplified example has just a couple of attributes, both on that RS element. RS stands for referencing string. It's an element you use when you have a reference to something you're interested in, but where the proper name of the entity at stake isn't actually used. In this case, we have a slightly indirect reference to Keating's History of Ireland, Forras Fecha Éireann, which is described here as Keating's manuscript. So we use the RS element to indicate that this string refers to something of note, and then we use the type attribute to say what type of thing we have. In this case, the title of a work. And then we can use another attribute, ref, not just to say that this is a title, but even to point to the entry for Keating's history in a bibliography. That way, if we wanted to find all of the references to this specific text, we could do so, even if they were inconsistently spelled, which is very common, or indirectly referenced. So that's pretty much what you do when you encode. You read through a document and you decide which of its features merit digital modeling. On the larger scale, this allows projects like the Women Writers Project to create substantial collections of text that include extremely detailed representations of their contents, structures, and features. On the smaller scale, it is an excellent way to teach students about digital editing and publication. The project I'll be discussing today is one that I've taught in several courses at Northeastern. I've been teaching versions of this project for about 6 years now, primarily in Renaissance literature and digital humanities courses, usually collaborating with faculty in our English department. So here are the core activities of the project. We ask students to each identify and encode a short archival document, typically from either early English books online or the English Broadside Ballad Archive. Each student has to locate, transcribe, and encode their document, marking out all of the textual features that they've decided to model using TEI elements and attributes. That decided to model point is really key. Any encoding project is going to formalize some features, but not others. And so we stress to the students that they should be making careful decisions about what they want their digital editions to represent. To help the students think through these choices, we put them into groups and we ask them to make their editorial decisions collectively. Each group needs to choose a primary audience and a goal for their digital editions, and all of their subsequent decisions will follow from that. For example, a student group might choose to publish a reading edition, primarily aimed at helping undergraduate students to understand the historical context for archival documents. And then that decision will impact how they approach regularization, annotation, contextualization, and so on. The students also use the TEI's provisions for applying interpretive annotations to their text. This encoding allows students to define their own contextual annotations, I think similar to what Claire was just discussing, actually. So they might mark language related to colonialism or positive representations of femininity. And then they just mark out any language within their documents where the concepts they have defined are relevant. The students collectively write an editorial declaration where they outline the decisions that they made in transcribing, editing, encoding, and publishing their documents. And then they also are making decisions about how their documents will appear online, including how they want to color code their interpretive annotations. To make all of this a bit more concrete, I'm going to walk briefly through an example student project. Students start with documents that look like this one, PDF facsimiles of 16th and 17th century text. We encourage them to choose fairly short documents, sometimes even just a single sheet broadside. If they want to do a selection from a larger document, that's also an option, but it needs to be a coherent extract and not just the first 4 pages before I ran out of steam. And then each student encodes their document according to the standards that their group has developed. For example, this group chose to do a semi-diplomatic edition focused on historical contextualization for a group of documents related to colonialism in the early Americas. I don't expect anyone to actually read this encoding, but I hope one thing will be clear is that how much of the text is green. All of the green text represents this student's comments on his decisions, thoughts, and questions from the encoding process. So for example, he is commenting that he's applying his group decisions about how to handle distinctive initial capitals and the long S character. He's also pointing out a place where he's decided to provide a Wikipedia link to give more context for an obscure word. And he's remarking on the decisions he's made about applying his group's interpretive annotations, such as his choice to mark out the phrase disobedient fishermen and mariners as being language related to New England, because these were common professions in colonial New England. And then finally, the students make decisions about how their documents will appear online. Here we're using a very lightweight publication mechanism where the students are just directly opening their documents in a web browser. We provide a file that the groups can customize to control how their documents will appear on the web. So for example, this student group is choosing to show all of the language related to New England in blue, the language related to colonialism in red, and the language related to religion in green. They've also decided to show their distinctive initial capital in a different font. It seemed important to them to preserve that information in the digital reading edition. There are some strong limitations to this publication mechanism. You can see here that it's not particularly flashy or modern looking, but its ease of use is far and away the most important aspect. Students basically just have to edit one file and then hit a single button, and then they can view their documents just as they will appear when they're published online. And then when it is time to publish, I just host their files on my own website. Probably the most important aspect of this assignment is framing the students' work as collaborators on a digital edition, asking them to develop a group standard and then apply it to their individual documents. This framing lets students begin to see what is in fact distinctive about individual texts and what is just a manifestation of early modern printing practices. Asking students to make these decisions collectively tends to engender healthy debates about what the goals and purposes of their digital editions really are. If you ever want to see a bunch of undergraduate students get exceptionally passionate about the long S character, this is a project that will do that. So for example, one group got very invested in the physical conditions of their documents and developed a detailed provision for encoding various causes of gaps and unclear text, and then a mechanism for displaying that information online. Another group decided on a feminist rereading of their documents, deliberately applying 21st century intersectional feminist values to read against the positive and negative associations of femininity in their 17th century texts. The group approach also allows us to consider the student's text as a corpus and to do some programmatic analysis. In particular, it's usually interesting for the students to see collective information on their interpretive annotations. They really get a lot out of seeing where and how they all applied their analytical taxonomies to the language in their individual documents. In assessing the student work, our primary focus is on thoughtfulness and careful decision-making. These are beginner projects, so they will typically have a few errors in the sense that some of their encoding might not be in line with TEI standards. But we don't focus on pure proficiency. Let me evaluate the students based on how clearly they have defined their project goals and how thoughtfully they are making subsequent decisions and choices to reflect those goals. With this in mind, it's essential that the students have plenty of space to explain their thinking. So that's why we emphasize commenting within their XML documents and why we provide them opportunities to explain their group decisions in their editorial declarations and to discuss their individual decisions in a reflective introduction. To wrap up, I'm also going to share a few of the strategies from this project that might be useful for others thinking about similar assignments. First, as with teaching any technical skill, it is important to integrate new methods with things the students already have experience in. In this case, we approach this project as an extremely detailed form of close reading. You do need to be careful to set boundaries around what will be possible, especially with the publication interface, so that students aren't expecting that they will be able to create their own early English books online in the space of a few weeks. And students also really value being treated as genuine editors, as people who are able to take ownership over the entire publication process. So I started this presentation with Sarah Butler's claim about there having been no less than 7,000 scholars at the University of Armagh. It will be a while until we get up to the thousands, but the expansiveness of that statement really speaks to what we're trying to do with this project, and opening up digital editing with text and coding for literature students in a broad range of classes. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Sarah. Yeah, the 7,000 scholars and your discussion of the collaborative satisfaction that students get from this kind of work reminded me of the concept of the social edition, to which many different editors contribute, and the particular example of the Devonshire manuscript, which was edited in a Wikimedia format by a group of scholars in Canada, and which I think provides a really interesting model for this kind of work as well. Okay, our next speaker is Lucy Hinnie, who is just finishing her post as a Leverhulme postdoctoral fellow in the Department of English at the University of Saskatchewan. She has recently returned to the UK to take up the role of the British Library Wikimedian in residence. Lucy is a graduate of both the University of Glasgow and the University of Edinburgh, where she did her PhD. Her postdoctoral project is entitled Digitizing the Bannatyne manuscript, circa 1568, and stems from her doctoral thesis, Figuring the Feminine in the Bannatyne manuscript, completed under the supervision of Dr. Sarah Donegan. Lucy's research focuses on material in older Scots and the application of medieval feminist theory. She works as an assistant editor on the Journal of the Northern Renaissance and is a member of the TEI by Example International Advisory Board. She's an active member of the Robert Henryson Society, and in 2015, she and Dr. Meg Oldman from Tarleton State founded the Medieval Scottish Makars Society. And Lucy can be found on Twitter at Eclepet. Did I pronounce that correctly? Take it away, Susie.
Thank you so much, Justin. I'm just going to share my screen with you all today. Press play. Hopefully this works. Thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to start with a confession. Justin, earlier you mentioned feeling that you were something of an interloper today. I too feel this. I'm by trade a medievalist rather than an early modernist. So I ask you all to bear that in mind as I proceed with this presentation. I'm currently coming to the end of my project, which was a 2-year partial digitization of the Bannatyne manuscript. I perhaps differ slightly from some of the other presentations today in that the teaching I'm going to speak about actually came from the project. This is kind of a project forward approach where the Bannatyne digitization gave me the opportunity to incorporate bits of it into my teaching, and those are the things I'd like to talk about today. The Bannatyne itself, just to give you a very brief overview of the Bannatyne. There we go. It's currently in the National Library of Scotland under Advocates Manuscript 1.1.6. It's the largest extant miscellany of older Scots literature. It's around 400 leaves, written single secretary hand. It features poems by Dunbar, Chaucer and Henryson, divided into the thematic sections of theology, morality, comedy, love, and fables. It's worth noting that this is a text that was actually compiled in time of plague. So in a 3-month seclusion from Edinburgh's plague-ridden streets, young George Bannatyne, a lawyer, compiled this manuscript, which has gone on to kind of preserve the Scottish canon to a large extent. There are images of the manuscript online and some PDF scans of a 1930s edition, but no scholarly accessible digital edition exists. My project focused on the 4th section of the manuscript, roughly 142 poems and 90 folios. Some drama did feature, and the Satire of the Three Estates is within the Bannatyne at the end of the 3rd section, and the curious Crying of Vain play, which is an interlude from an unknown play that appears only in this manuscript. So the editing I've been doing has been a largely solo endeavour. In fact, as I started my new post, I've been reflecting in the last week or two on just how isolating the process has been, particularly during the last year. The aim of the Bannatyne project was always to make something pedagogically useful, and to me, the way forward for this was involving students in the process, both in terms of consultation and practical work. Some textual editing, but also some wiki activity in terms of editing Wikipedia. This was all hampered somewhat by the pandemic and the time frame of the project, but there were highlights that I'm going to touch upon today. So there are 2 contexts in which I worked with the Bannatyne in teaching. The first was for the CMRS course Advanced Manuscript Studies, which was a one-on-one module in which the editing process came to the fore. If we were going to speak about tedium and detail-oriented processes, this is certainly where that took the fore here. I was given the opportunity to supervise one student over a semester, and their role was to go through the transcription of the Bannatyne's 4th section. We were working primarily with 1960s COCO encoded files and transferring this raw text into a workable TEI encoding. The second context in which I worked with the Bannatyne was primarily literary, with editing as a kind of light touchstone, an intro, or if you will, baby editing. This was for English 400-800, Medieval Women, which was a class of 14 students, a mix of undergraduates and graduates. For the last 5 weeks of the course, we used the Bannatyne as our primary text. We looked at pastorals, short epigrams, 2 longer poems, a Wikimedia exercise, a Wikipedia editathon, and a final discussion exercise on the excerpt from the Crying of Vain play. The approaches I took were quite different. So for the work we did in CMRS as a one-on-one unit, the work was largely experiential and to do with contextualizing the manuscript. My student Tiana was given a collection of articles about the manuscript with historical context, ideas about why TEI was useful and the potentiality there, and some thematic input as well as to the content of the poems that she would be transcribing. We took time to discuss current questions in the field of digitization. We worked together on a collaborative document of our principles for editing and transcription, and made sure at all points to use open source software to expand that practice out in a kind of open and inclusive way. With Medieval Women, there was less direct editorial work, with the exception of the Wikithon. The Wikithon itself, I aimed to give the students direct editorial experience of secondary sources. This seemed to boost their confidence when it came to the poems we were dealing with, and highlighted to me perhaps the importance of context in establishing a student's bearings, and also the leveling effect of working in a wiki context. The format this took really in terms of an approach was a querying and feedback kind of process. I wanted the students to see under the hood of what went into making an edition, and to give them pause and give them some thought as to how they might approach such a task themselves. There was a kind of trajectory here that I'd like to think about over the 5 weeks. So in week 1, I presented them with a poem as a full edition with explanatory notes that I had worked on, with glosses, with further information for them. This led to the second week,
where they were each given a short epigram of around 5 to 7 lines in small groups. They were given these to take away, to translate, to think about how they might gloss these texts and how they might present them. These shorter excerpts were given with the hope that they would be less overwhelming, and we discussed the decisions they had made about meaning and about glossing. And we then revealed translations that I had worked on to see where the common ground was and what worked and what didn't in terms of both. Week 3, we came back to full translations, but with a better idea, I think, about how to discuss these in a detailed way, how to look at decision-making processes, and how that might feed into their own practice. Week 4 was the Wikithon, where we worked together with the National Library of Scotland on how to edit Wikipedia material, taking us out of that context of poetic editing and into this idea of a more objective principle for editing, working with the Wikimedia ideas of notability, verifiability, neutral point of view, and citation. The final exercise appended on after the Wikithon with the realisation that we had one class left to go and a decision to make about what we would like to cover in it. We did a sight unseen exercise where they were given the excerpt from the Crying of Vain play and framed as a discussion exercise. We asked them to do some editing and some translation there and then to try and deal with the kind of paralysing fear that a lot of students felt looking at some of this early modern Scottish material and older Scots material. My aim was to get rid of the panic and the silence that can often come from students who feel overwhelmed by the work they've been given, a silence that seems to ring even more in a Zoom classroom. There were challenges, big challenges with this work. Artistic picture of a cat challenging a dog, or a dog challenging a cat, depending on how you look at it. Access to materials, this is something that others on this forum today have spoken about. There was a lot of behind the scenes labour in terms of giving students the tools to begin to edit, translate and work with these texts. This involves things like scanning, working with OCR, doing a certain amount of pre-editing to get it to the level that some of these students at undergraduate level would be capable of dealing with. There's fear. I think there's a huge amount of fear. Students freeze in terms of dealing with older Scots language, and that's something that it is quite hard to overcome. And I felt often the real disadvantage of being out of the classroom here. It's much easier for students to drop off or disengage over a remote learning platform. Translation became a bit of a bugbear. It becomes something of a crutch for students, I think, in dealing with these texts. And I liked what Claire was saying in her presentation about make a good faith attempt to interpret what you have there. Trying to encourage them to do that is difficult. And I think there are questions as well about, you know, what they hope to get from the material. Is the translation in and of itself the work, or would you rather look at what you have translated in a thematic kind of way? I was also secretly trying to highlight to them that translation is in and of itself quite hard work, because a lot of student evaluations will come back with, this would have been better if the prof had translated everything. So perhaps there was a hidden agenda there on my part. And assessment. Assessment was a really interesting thing to come to in both contexts, with the one-on-one and the seminar work. What I would say is formative assessment, and that's something I've seen reflected in every presentation today. Formative assessments were the way forward here. Kristen and Sarah articulated this a lot better than I did in talking about metacognitive praxis and the description of the thinking processes. In my one-on-one work with Tiana, we were looking at written output in terms of reflection, reflecting on time management, reflecting on the practical process of transcription and editing. And in Medieval Women, we were looking at short formative feedback over Canvas, short reflections, check-in points at weekly meetings, and encouraging them to produce blog material and reflecting on things they'd learned in that course. Assessing a wikithon is really difficult because it's obviously quite a transient format. So that is something I would say, I've really just written in my notes here, plan this better. Whether that's a note to me or to you, I'll leave that open to interpretation. I think as well, there's a need, certainly at this point in my career as an early career researcher, to accept the learning curve element of the course as an instructor. You too are going to have to be flexible as the students are in terms of your assessment format. Advice. Some of this is just generic remote learning advice, I think, but a lot of it directly contributes to this idea of editing. Be bold and experimental. Take yourself and your students out of your comfort zone. Admit to what you know you don't know. This was a huge thing for me, was putting my project out there and opening myself up to feedback. Formative assessment goes both ways. There were straw polls and weekly check-ins with students to make sure that we were all on the same page. And I think particularly in 2020, there was a real focus on pastoral care, both in terms of the subject and environment we were working in. Is the subject matter landing with students? Is the workload balanced? Should there be trigger warnings on what you're asking them to actually edit and translate and transcribe? Always consider the emotional toil of editing. This came up particularly with our work on the pastorals. A flexible approach to the syllabus, being aware and open to change, was also a key point and a key piece of advice I would give to people moving forward. Those are my brief kind of reflections on the two very liminal pieces of teaching that I did during my time at the University of Saskatchewan. Thank you so much for having me today. You can find work on the Bannatyne project with the website about to launch at bannatyne.org, and the work of those medieval women students at the USask blog there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy. That was really terrific. And just the different emphases of the different presentations and the scope and scale of each of the projects we've heard about has it's just given me lots and lots to think about, as I'm sure it is for our audience. And I was particularly struck in Lucy's presentation about the idea of using Wikipedia editing as a kind of an analogous example of what students do in scholarly editing. So the kind of idea of having light encoding, citation and referencing requirements and expectations that are expected in editing Wikipedia, and how they bear a relation to what is expected in a scholarly edition. So I really like that idea of kind of gently introducing students through Wikipedia to similar ideas in scholarly editing. So our final speaker is Jennifer Nicholson, who gets extra bonus points because of the ungodly hour in Australia at which she is bringing us this presentation. Jennifer is a sessional academic in literary and interdisciplinary studies at the University of Sydney, and a secondary teacher in training at the University of New South Wales. Jennifer researches from the early modern period into the 21st century with a focus on the various edges of the English language in a range of literary forms. Her projects span Shakespeare, particularly Hamlet, Montaigne, early modern drama, Renaissance books, untranslatability, theology, and desire. Primarily an early modernist, Jennifer's primary area of interest is the presence of French and French English in early modern English play texts. She is also working on and off on a longer project concerning Anglophone versions of films produced by the Japanese film studio Ghibli. Jennifer has work recently published in edited collections spanning from early modern drama to Anglophone translations of Japanese films. And you can find Jennifer on Twitter at JustGenerally. Jennifer.
Thanks very much, Justin. I seem to be having some slight odd situation with my video, so I'm going to ignore, you can just not see me, that's fine, you don't need to see me, and I'll just share my slides. All right. Yes, firstly, quickly, if I make no sense, it's because it's a bit after 3 o'clock in the morning, my time. And secondly, I'd like to, as I tend to acknowledge that I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land the University of Sydney is built. I'm kind of representing them as I speak this morning for me. Land was never bought, sold, or ceded, and so always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I am going to share some observations from teaching early modern plays to undergraduate students, and also a mixture of honours and master's students in different kind of cohorts. In the Department of English at Sydney, I've been fortunate to teach author study units on Shakespeare and Marlowe, and also a unit that's sort of loosely titled Approaches to Genre, and introduces students to genre and theory. So, sorry, my screen is doing some slightly odd things here. Bear with me. There we go. So this is the template for an activity that I will get students to do in class. This is very much a mini project rather than an assignment. I will leave you to read that in your own time. But you can see there's a general call to pitch something and an editing activity. And I ask students to consider a topic or topics in relation to what we've been learning about, or their own knowledge or interests or intended readers. So what I'm asking is that students take on the role of an editor as a means of learning for themselves and sometimes teaching each other. It's evident from this compared to something like Claire's amazing assignment. This is very much a class exercise rather than a full assignment. I hope that this, though, is a kind of helpful, engaging, small scale kind of sample activity. I am hoping to trial this as some kind of assignment in future, but I'm yet to have had that much control over an assessment schedule due to the kind of work that I do. So I'm going to share some little observations about what students tend to notice or leave out in these discussions. I'll explore how I think about this in relation to the way Montaigne writes about editing. And I'll mention why his work specifically appeals to me later. And I'll also give you an explanation as to why my working title for this thinking borrows Marlowe's lines, circles, scenes, letters, and characters from Dr. Faustus. So my first cohort under the microscope are the students that I've had in undergraduate Shakespeare classes. This was across 2 different semesters. They were actually largely secondary education students in their 3rd or 4th year of a 5-year degree. And occasionally there were 2nd or 3rd year students in a regular Bachelor of Arts majoring in English. So teaching students were particularly interested in how Shakespearean language actually works. They wanted to know how it works so that they could teach it. And many had been encouraged to take the unit for that specific reason. Those who were taking the unit within their degree for a more kind of within the arts degree often mentioned they felt that Shakespeare was a kind of milestone that they needed to pass. So for these students, I asked them to pitch Act 1 of The Winter's Tale. Most chose early to mid high school students as their readers, which was interesting, although I think partially because many of them were teachers. Their annotations were always very minimal. So they would annotate key things in more detail rather than lots of things in small detail. They spent a lot of the activity time discussing how they would approach The Winter's Tale, having now read 4 other plays on the unit. So it was the last play of 5 in the semester. They felt they were better equipped to read Shakespeare's words in an individual sense, but tripped up on the strangeness of Winter's Tale's phrasing and nebulous generic boundaries. Nevertheless, when preparing their notes and ideas for discussion, they would spend time looking up definitions for unusual words, or ones that might not be unusual but have changed in meaning in the last 400 years. And they would also explain allusions sometimes, but usually word definitions. This was a skill we had encouraged for them earlier in the semester. And we also spent some time in the unit making note of how characters' language would indicate stagecraft. So many students' annotations included quite insightful editorial stage directions informed by characters' words. By paying closer attention to the words in relation to their theatrical function rather than in the rhetorical or literary sense, students were often able to pass Shakespeare more fluently than if I asked them to give a literary analysis of a speech, which I thought was quite interesting. Also with Shakespeare, but in a combined honours and masters subject for genre, we had much less time with Shakespeare. We had 2 weeks on early modern texts, and that was it. 2 weeks of 2 hours each. So we used this activity as a way to peer teach reading early modern drama to one another. That's how I used it. These students were much more interested in finding out specific terminology even than the previous Shakespeare students I mentioned. But they would spend a lot of time looking up words and then thinking about all the reasons that that word might be there. So a word like welcome, they would annotate in this activity. I got them to annotate the first few pages of The Tempest with different scenes given to different groups around the classroom. Some of these students were current teachers, actually returning to take on a master's in English. Others were returning to study after a break or moving from an undergraduate course in something related to English, so say creative writing or journalism. Interestingly to me, the honours students, so the students that had done a major in English in their main undergraduate studies, many of whom had taken the undergraduate Shakespeare and Marlowe subjects, were best equipped for the text complexity, but by no means the most deft editors when they were asked to annotate and explain to one another. Last but not least, in the Marlowe unit that I was given for a semester to run, I gave students the final act of Dido, Queen of Carthage at the end of semester, which was possibly slightly cruel, but it was good fun. This cohort were largely in their third year of a 3-year degree. The BA here is 3 years. They had a similar combination of education and art students in their cohort. Several from each seminar had taken the Shakespeare unit at some point prior to that year. We had begun this unit with a focus on Marlowe's biography. You can see the summary of the unit of study description that sort of advertises the unit to students. And we did talk about this in the first little while of the semester. So many students referred to this material when they were defending their ideas about his texts. Thinking about editing then was an opportunity for students to think more about Marlowe as one of many early modern playwrights. This steered them away from individual biography and individual authorship. This was particularly useful because most students had read only Shakespeare if they had read any early modern drama at all. So this was really helpful. But doing this editorial work still allowed them to think about things like individual style. They could identify a Marlovian trope or expression according to what they understood to be his style. They were particularly attuned to alternative spellings, to his more bombastic and melodramatic phrasing, and also really interested in the way that he uses classical and historical allusion. Some students also tackled with some success the fraught idea of adaptation in relation to the Aeneid. And so in this way, their conversation moved towards the rather blurry line between editing and retelling. This not only opened up questions about, say, genre and the play. So, you know, they asked, is the end of Dido dramatic or melodramatic? But it meant that we could consider Marlowe's role in the text not as a capital A author, but as a playwright, or what I would call a play builder in both this unit and in the Shakespeare one. So given my students varied discussions of how they might edit these Shakespearean Marlovian plays, I sort of took a sample and reviewed some of this material that they had discussed and produced. And I was thinking about Michel de Montaigne's thoughts on editing. So early in his, the last essay in his collection on experience, he asks rather fantastically, when is it agreed between us that this book has enough and there is nothing more to say about it? His comment emerges from a discussion of editing and glossing legal texts. So he was a lawyer by training, but his words can apply to scholarly editing practices too. So scholarly editions of Shakespearean, Marlovian, Montaignian texts maintain but also expand on editorial qualities that I would say their original texts already feature, things like rewriting, annotation, or explanatory glossing. So these other little dot points on the screen are some other things I'm kind of very cursorily paraphrasing parts of On Experience there. The late David Bevington drew attention to the way that editions references to each other or to multiple source texts can be somewhat daunting. So what is one to make, he asks, of such telegraphic information written evidently in a strange sort of code, and reading, for instance, as follows. And then he gives this rather wonderful excerpt that I've put in a box on the screen for us. We might consider scholars' work as aiming for editing that commits to some kind of ending or interpretation, but also points to the text's retelling. We should therefore encourage students' reading practices that do likewise, whether that's in an in-class editorial task in the small sense, but also in their general reading, analysis, and essays, which of course are frequently the format being assessed, even if we want to develop alternative assessment, if we're thinking more broadly about their assessment in a sort of humanities kind of degree. Within my own personal study of Montaigne alongside Hamlet, I've thought about Montaigne and Hamlet's reflections on their imminent endings, so their textual and literal ones. And I've thought about these as mirrors of each other, much like how scholarship celebrates and mourns editions of texts as they're produced and then made obsolete by their new editions. However, while previous editions are obsolete in a formal sense, and indeed often replaced, the previous editions still remain valuable. So most obviously, the previous editions form parts of the glosses that new editors then include in their copies of a text. Older editions also provide insight into a period of scholarship too. So we get a sense not only of an editorial perspective, but a philosophical one. And all of this has value to me in the classroom. After asking my students that I've kind of reviewed for you, all of these students, after I asked them to undertake their editorial task, I asked them, think about how the auditions we've used for class might have contributed to your understanding of the text. We discussed the extent to which that editing, we discussed the extent to which editing influences their reading, and then also acknowledged that the editing process they undertook was not inherently different to the task of understanding and analysing a piece of literature some other way. So drawing my students' attention to ideas about editing helps some students think about authorship, say, but not too much, or there's space to consider how theatrical texts are probably not being written by only one person, or at least not the final version. Multiple versions of a text could result from editions, and this could influence how it might be performed in a different theatre space or style, but also with a different final script. The reason I use Marlowe's phrasing from Faustus to kind of embody what I'm thinking about here is I'm thinking about connections between students, teachers, editors, and scholars as they, to quote Montaigne, intergloss a text to read it. I was looking at this opening page of Montaigne's annotated essays, and I thought, well, this line rather neatly encapsulates the lines, the circles, the letters, the characters. In this case, it's Montaigne himself, and the scenes I'll get to in a second. Even though we organize units of study around, say, authors, collaboration in early modern playtexts spans playwrights back then all the way to editors now, as in, say, the case of scene division, which might get added in by someone that is not, as I tell my students, Shakespeare or Marlowe. But when I'm thinking about this process between playwrights and editors, I'm throwing the teachers and the students who read those texts in too. And so I'm hoping that these activities help students to consider that further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I really liked your allusion to Montaigne, where he thinks about when is the stage reached when there's nothing more to say about a book. It's useful in thinking about how we as teachers can guide the students towards particular aspects of the text to focus in on in their editions. But also your example of older editions, many of which may have thought of themselves as definitive, as you know, providing the final word on a particular text, but which have been superseded over time, as is the natural effect of scholarly editing, and how digital editing in particular can remedy that in some senses, because it offers a more fluid and dynamic environment to continue editing a text over time. So thank you very much to all of our speakers who have provided much fruit for thought and discussion. And we have a little time for some questions and some discussion, if our panelists are ready and willing to perhaps answer a few questions. So for those of you who are in the audience, if you'd like to add any questions to the chat, we will get to those. But perhaps if I might begin the discussion with a question to you all, or to whomever might like to answer it. It's about assessment. So I'm interested to hear whether you had, what strategies you may have used for assessing your students' work, either individually or collectively, and whether how you wanted to assess their work ran up against institutional rules about grades that must be assigned to students, or things like that. So I'll put that out there for whomever would like to answer.
I can start. I can show you my assessment rubric for the assignment. I didn't do that in the presentation because it was going to take too much time, but let me just do that very quickly. So I grade a class on a 100-point scale. So this assignment was worth 15 total points. I'm a very generous grader. I will say that, because as I said before, it was really the good faith effort. If students put in a good faith effort, they probably got an A on this assignment. Really, students who didn't failed to do part of the assignment or were struggling in some other way that had very little to do with the assignment. So I graded them on completion, basically like, did you do the whole assignment? And they had to do all parts of the assignment to even be up for a grade. And then like, did they make a good faith effort to do all the parts of the assignment? This was the appendix to the assignment sheet. So they had this right up front. They knew how they were being graded on it. And as I said, I think out of my 25 students in the class, I think like 21 of them got A's on the assignment because of the fact that they put in the good faith effort. Yeah, I mean, I did assess quality a little bit, but by the time they handed it in, we'd gone through so many steps that what they handed in was of good quality, and that their reflection, I really graded them on their reflection, to be honest, their reflection letter. So hopefully it's helpful to kind of see this. I mean, there are ways to do this that are much stingier, but to be honest, I don't want to put in that kind of, this kind of work that's so new to me and them up to such scrutiny.
I think what you're saying is really interesting, Claire. I'm glad to know that it wasn't just me that was kind of generous when grading that kind of stuff. I think we hit a couple of obstacles because I was teaching in the fall semester, and expectations of assessment were also shaped by the pandemic. So there was a certain amount of the institution getting used to how do we prove participation online. So the biggest pushback really was, departmental guidelines say we should be doing Canvas discussion boards. Students do not like Canvas discussion boards. So there was a tension there, but I think what you're saying is right. With processes like this, it's about good faith effort and rewarding that effort rather than the kind of overall goodness or quality of it. So that's actually really reassuring to hear. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I work along the same lines as you two. I'm pretty generous. It's so much work. Recall tedium. If they put that good faith effort into each stage of the process, then I'm fine with that. And the metacognitive reflections, I have a new category, and it inspired me to put a thoughtfulness category in all of my rubrics. And how engaged are you in this material? Are you using specific examples? Are you tying your emotional experience, your affective engagement with this project to the text or to what you learned, to a skill? And I find that really helpful. My problem with the institutional, my department will not give up on the research paper component. I cannot replace this assignment. I hope sincerely, I'm so grateful for today, that I can use today as evidence to kind of push back and to demonstrate the real pedagogical value of these assignments, and that many can have so much more value than a 5 or 10 page paper that students write the weekend before the last week of classes or final exams. So I've struggled to do that. And with that in mind, I've seen Claire's assignment, and I took it and I kind of adapted some of it. I made it more of a research paper in one case when I tried to pull this off, so that I would meet department needs, but it was a lot of work for the students. It was really too much with finals approaching also. So I'm still working that out, but I'll keep doing it, and I'm not teaching this way no matter what.
I might just pop in with kind of a follow-up to this past question. So, I mean, one thing that I found really striking sort of surrounding assessment is so many of you talked about actually having kind of an explicit reflection and that being part of the whole process, like to sort of incorporate that reflection in some way. I have the experience in kind of very different contexts of when I've asked students sometimes to write a reflection piece, they can interpret this in very, very different ways. And you know, some are kind of more surface than others when you ask for this sort of thing. And I'm just wondering, you know, is it through rubrics that you think that you can kind of deal with kind of getting the reflections into the right place? Like, what are your thoughts on the best way to kind of steer that self-reflection too? And I'll say as well, I really liked Kristen's idea there of having that thoughtfulness category in the rubric. That seems potentially kind of helpful, but I'm just wondering what other sort of advice you'd have around, you know, how do you structure a reflection piece to get the kind of response that you really ideally want to see?
Just briefly, so with these projects, sometimes I set out learning objectives at the beginning of the project, and I ask them to reflect upon how well they believe they achieved the learning objectives, and I find that really helpful. I do that for the course. Again, so many things I've learned from these assignments has bled into my conventional pedagogy and made it better.
One thing I tell my students, in addition to giving them a kind of list of questions that they can address, is to ask them to take a pedagogical stance and to teach me how to read the piece, that the edition in this case that they're handing in. I mean, I do reflection letters on all projects, but I find that the more I stress that I'm not inside their head and they have to teach me how to look at the thing they've made and the thing that they've developed and the thing that they've created and why they've done what they've done, I find that when I started doing that, I got much higher quality and, as Kristen says, kind of like more thoughtful reflections, because I think especially the students that I teach, they want to, and I'm not alone here, they want to know how to get an A, right? They want to know what's right and what's wrong. But I have to tell them that I'm not testing them here. So, and I think once I can get around that and tell them, right, teach me how to see it the way you see it. This is not objective. That has really helped, not for all students, but for some students, that has really helped them write reflections that are really substantive. And compelling, actually. And they really do make me see the work in a different way than if I just received the edition and I was going to grade it. Like they've persuaded me. It's about persuasion. And they all take a critical writing course, right? Like, how do you write persuasively? And I'm like, that's what you're doing here. You're persuading me to see it in the way you see it.
I might just add that we also take that persuasion approach. Oh, sorry, Justin.
No, go ahead, Sarah.
That we we essentially tell the students, this is all about your careful, thoughtful decision-making. And the reflective introduction is the place where you outline all of those decisions, because we cannot read your mind. And so that tends to give really specific, precise introductions that focus on thoughtfulness and doing things deliberately, rather than just, well, I grabbed the first element that I could see in front of me. So sorry, I just wanted to throw that in there.
I was just going to say that Jennifer has added a comment.
Oh, I can speak.
Oh, sure.
Via the mic, if that's easier. Sorry, my camera is doing something really bizarre, and so it just won't turn on. It's very bizarre. I was just going to say, I've not for the task that I was discussing today, but in teaching reflective writing for other courses, both in and outside of humanities kind of Englishy stuff, having the kind of a key guiding question or two I found is the most useful. So something, I mean, I hadn't thought of it specifically framing like pedagogy, but that's a great way, teach me how to, if you give them the task is almost, this is, write a reflection letter that teaches your marker how to interpret your work, like, or whatever it is, you could actually frame it with, we had a course for actually students in the medical school, but they were reflective writing on their own practices and things. And we asked them to discuss their interpretation of a case study, and then also what they were going to do with that interpretation. So something that changed as a result of that interpretation. And we just said it just had to be one thing, but having those two guiding questions helped them to switch from just retelling their understanding of the case study, like I read the case study and this is what I understand, and switched it to this affects my practice in these ways. And then they had space to reflect from there.
We had a little bit of space in Medieval Women to play with the format of reflection, which the undergraduates took to quite well. So there were some artistic renderings of reflection on work. Someone did a monologue and a reflection on why they picked that monologue about Joan of Arc. And it was good. I think that I had the privilege of it being quite a small class, so I was able to actively engage with the reasoning part as they came to do it. But I really recognize what you're saying, Claire, about the anxiety of like, but how do I pass a reflection? And I think it was a real joy in this time, in the pandemic times, to give them something that was much more creative. And I think I was much more liberal with that than I would have been if it had been a typical year. Yeah, it was interesting. The results are up on the blog, so they're quite interesting to look at. Someone even did a Real Housewives interpretation of one of the poems that we've looked at together, which is actually very good. So yeah, it was fun. But looking at how reflection, I spent a lot of time thinking about how do students reflect in and of their everyday lives, and how can we make this speak to them and connect with them, and asking those questions but getting the answers in a way that felt truthful and felt real to them.
If I could ask another question about managing the workload or things like that. It's becoming increasingly clear to me that Lindsay and I probably will not be able to do everything that we may have expected we might have been able to get done within the space of a semester. But I noticed that the projects used TEI and encoding to greater and lesser degrees. So I'm wondering, for those of you who used quite a lot of TEI encoding, how students found that and whether they had any experience of markup before. And those of you who maybe used it a little less, was that a deliberate choice to allow you to focus on more editorial or literary or historical aspects?
I feel like Sarah should get us started, because she is the hands down expert to my mind, and I've learned so much from her.
Well, I do think I might be on the far end of the uses a lot of TEI spectrum. Yeah, so we focus intensively on this. We spend weeks just teaching the students the markup and teaching them XML while we're also thinking about, like, how do you write an edition, and how do you make editorial decisions, and how do you read other people's editions. And I have found typically the class that I'm teaching now is an even split between English majors and computer science majors. And the students really value the opportunity to learn from each other. So the computer science majors typically have seen XML if they've not seen TEI. And so they're a little bit less intimidated by pointy brackets, but they're also a little intimidated by close reading. And so we do a lot of mutual mentoring among the students. This year in particular, they love breakout rooms. They love learning from each other and sharing screens. And we also sort of emphasize that, that these might feel alarming and unfamiliar, but they're masterable skills. And so we give them lots of opportunity to practice in class, and a lot of opportunity to really talk about what you're doing when you're marking up a document. How are you making decisions? How are you thinking about a document when you're treating it as an ordered hierarchy of content objects, and thinking about linking between pieces of the document? So we actually treat the TEI as something that needs interrogation just as much as their readings of the document, their understanding early modern print culture, and then their sort of, associations that they're trying to draw into the broader world of scholarship. And I could say a lot more, but I want to give other folks a chance to talk. So I'll put a pin in it there.
I'd love to jump in because I think I'm kind of in the middle on the TEI spectrum. In my experience, and I first taught this with Janelle Jenstead, we co-taught, she was at UVic, I was then at Stonehill College outside Boston, and we co-taught a unit teaching TEI, which was a wild ride. Sarah drove down to help one day. She's part of the It Takes a Village advice that I gave you at the end. But I was working with not English majors. I had no English majors when I first started doing this. It was a gen ed class. And the TEI unit was, it took 8 weeks to create a text. I didn't have the great luxury of working with an English major until I just did a test run with one of my now graduate students this summer, because I'm teaching TEI in another week. And I didn't know how to teach it on Zoom, which is another can of worms. But we also spent a fair amount of time with the transcription and then the markup. And like, as Sarah said, interrogating the markup, and the markup offers so many opportunities to ask, what is this valuing? What is this describing? The sex tags, before TEI just amended that this year, when we were grappling, think about Zeus. When he visits Leda as a swan, is he still a person? Hermaphroditus, 1 for male or 2 for female. So the opportunities are really to take students at any level of experience and give them these opportunities to dig deep and see what detail-oriented critical thinking feels like. And that's always the really exciting takeaway for me.
Yeah, if I can just jump in here, I do not have the technical knowledge that Kristen and Sarah have. I am learning it thanks to John Russell in our library. I'm doing a TEI course this semester to kind of get up to speed. But I've done this in a couple of different ways, right? My undergrad class that I presented on today, there was no encoding involved. The encoding was taken up by our research assistant, but in the same semester, I taught a grad course that was on where they edited A Wife for a Month, one of the annotated plays, where they learned theories of editing, histories of editing, practices of editing, and XML and TEI. I mean, those students, I have so much respect for them. I had no idea what I was asking them to do at the beginning of that semester. So I have so much respect for them that they stepped up and they did it. I would never, ever do that again, because there is too much theory involved in editing. And as Kristen, you described so beautifully, there's so much theory involved in TEI markup as well. And I think that what I'm doing with a research assistant now, she spent the fall editing a play, and she's now in this TEI class with me. She's spending the spring doing the XML and the TEI encoding. And in an ideal world, if I taught this class again, it would be over the course of a year. I think having those two, being able to deal with those two components kind of separately, I think is the most pedagogically expedient and worthwhile way of doing it. So once I've done my TEI training, you can ask me again, but I think right now that is the model that I think is best of the 3 that I have experienced so far.
I'm a little conscious of the time here and that we've already run a little over time, and I know that Sarah has a meeting in a couple of minutes. So I perhaps I could just maybe ask Lindsay if she had any final questions or comments before we maybe move towards closing the session.
I guess just a final kind of comment that I have. I mean, first of all, just thank you so much for, you know, coming and sharing all of this about your projects. It's so incredibly useful, especially when we're in the phase of kind of designing something for ourselves, and, you know, to hear what people have tried and the different forms that this sort of project has taken elsewhere. It's so useful, and I mean, there's so many things for us to think about. But I guess one thing that I would just kind of reiterate too, kind of in closing, is something that I mentioned at the outset, which is that, you know, when we first started talking about this, and we've actually been talking about this for, I don't know, at least a year at this point, as kind of an idea of something that we should do, you know, one of the first things that I was doing is kind of Googling around online, like who else has done this sort of thing, with the sense that, like, you know, there are definitely people out there who are doing projects like this. But as I said, you know, one of the challenges is actually kind of locating, like, who are the other people who are working on things like this. And, you know, one of the only sort of good ways of finding this information I found, you know, and coming at this from someone who is not a digital humanities person as well, but an early modernist, you know, it was looking at sort of like recent conference sort of information, and, you know, who's sort of presenting about things. But I just kind of wanted to throw this out there as a sort of final thing, and ask maybe, you know, is there a sense of that there is a kind of network of connected people? I mean, I'm aware that a lot of you have sort of connected over these projects before and talked about them before. You know, is there more of a network out there that kind of exists in terms of people who are doing this kind of work and sharing ideas about this kind of teaching?
I think the biggest thing I would say is that from my limited experience of having just kind of moved over to DH in the last 2 years, it's a strikingly collaborative community, and people are just so helpful. I think if you come up through pure literature or pure history or pure discipline, you're taught, you're in your tower, keep your ideas, that's where the value is. Whereas in DH, that just explodes that idea, and, you know, it's all collaborative, it's all admitting what you don't know and finding help from other people, and that's the biggest lesson, I think, is what I try to teach my students as well, is just put yourself out there, and DH is a great field to do it in. So don't feel like you're not a DH person, like everyone is, like everyone. They just haven't met each other yet, you know.
I don't want to speak for Josh Eckhardt, but I just do want to point out that the kind of work that he's been doing with transcribathons, he and I ran one when I was there, and he's continued to do that work. And the Folger also, Marissa Nicosia's a rare cooking project as well. And a lot of the early modern women and recipe projects are also doing this kind of work. So I think there's a huge network there as well that we kind of haven't talked too much about here today, but I just want to underline some of that really awesome work that's going on in the classroom, and is empowering students to do work with primary documents and primary evidence in inspiring ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it comes back to my "it takes a village" slide. And when I just did that I'm teaching networking in my intro to DH class, which we just got up and running thanks to some of the editorial work and collaborations I've done with Map of Early Modern London, Women Writers Project. And so I wasn't formally trained in DH. I kind of picked this up. I met Janelle Jenstad at the Rare Books exhibit at SAA, and we just struck up, we just hit it off. And the next thing I knew, I was teaching TEI, and I didn't know anything about it. And it was totally trial by fire, but such a great experience. There's really nothing like it, and so much support. Again, like Sarah, I put out a cry for help, and people drove from Boston down to Stonehill, which was like 45 minutes away. And everybody, there's so much, such a great sense of community, and people willing, as Lucy was saying, you know, to pitch in and help. And if you don't think of yourself as a DHer, I'd love that. You are, like, everybody will help you get up and running.
Thank you so much.
So on that positive point, that is perhaps the best place to close our session. Again, with thanks to all of you for your generosity in sharing so much detail and insight about all the wonderful projects that you've worked on. You've given Lindsay and I so much to think about, and we're very, very grateful for that. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in for this session, and please keep an eye out on our social media account of Curriculum and Canon for future sessions. We will leave it there for today. Thank you very much.